Welcome to the Families in Global Transition Conference 2022. This presentation is called Strengthen Your Roots to Weather the Storm, Grounding in Values to Grow Through Difficult Times. I'm Dr. Faye. My pronouns are she, her. I'm an American counseling psychologist and also a member of the U.S. Foreign Service family. I am an eligible family member, or EFM, for those of you who know what I'm talking about. And in this last year, I transitioned to private practice, which largely serves the Foreign Service community.
And I'm Frances. I'm a counselor in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. My pronouns are she and her, and I've been abroad in Asia since 2008, and I've been living and working in Vietnam for the last 3.5 years.
Yeah, that's right. Frances and I have both been in Vietnam for the entirety of the pandemic, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We learned a lot during that time out here, and we found that our existential leanings were incredibly helpful, not just for ourselves, but for our clients. We spent hundreds of hours in the therapy room and in our homes and on telehealth over the last couple of years. And we'd like to share some of the ideas that were most helpful for ourselves and our clients with you. So the existential themes and theories that got us through these difficult times.
And we're going to be talking about existentialism in this talk. And so before we start, I'd just like to let you know that existentialism covers some really big topics. It's essentially about life and living. And so it's complicated, like people are complicated. So what we're hoping to do here is just to summarize some of the big themes and be able to point you in the right direction. Because the path for each person is going to be as unique as the person themselves.
Right. So we're talking about existential suffering today, which sounds very grandiose, but in fact, it's not. It's just thinking about life and living. It's about existence. So all existentialists know that we spend half of our time debating all of the big questions of life and the other half thinking none of it matters and it's all absurd. So welcome to the journey, and we'll jump right in.
Yes. So we want to start by talking about the pandemic and specifically asking the question, why has the pandemic led to so much suffering? So a really simple model to look at this is the risk over resources model. And when I say risk, what I mean is the external stresses that we face. So, for example, if you lost your job during the pandemic, then your level of risk, your number of external stresses would go up. You might be worried about paying your bills. You might be worried about keeping your house, maybe even feeding yourself or your family. At the same time, your resources will have dramatically decreased because you won't have those finances coming in that serves as a protective factor. And when our risks outweigh our resources, that's when we experience stress.
Mm-hmm. Right. So another way of looking at that exact same idea, using a model that maybe many people are familiar with, is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So you can see that on the slide there. And usually many of us probably attending this conference have the privilege of hanging out in the top half of that pyramid, that we are working on our self-actualization needs, love and belonging, community, self-esteem. However, this pandemic knocked us all down a few rungs. As Frances was saying, some of us were struggling with even basic physiological needs. Maybe our shelter was threatened. Maybe it was hard to obtain food sometimes. That was certainly the case out here in Vietnam.
It was.
But all of us struggled with this idea of safety needs and feeling secure. And it also, of course, around health. And when we spend more time in those lower rungs, we're experiencing the stress of not having the upper part of that pyramid in place. It becomes much heavier for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And a final way to define the suffering caused by the pandemic is to split it into existential issues. Now, there are 4 basic existential issues. We're talking about groundlessness, isolation, identity, and death. So groundlessness is the idea that we have to make decisions about our life, sometimes against the backdrop of a world that can seem quite chaotic and meaningless. And I think this is really relevant to the pandemic because, as Faye just said, we were knocked down a few tiers on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so we had to make decisions around our level of exposure, our safety, and often be doing that with conflicting and confusing advice from the authorities. Now, the next one is isolation, and that's pretty self-explanatory. Many people suffered with isolation during the pandemic, particularly those living alone, and particularly during government-mandated isolation measures. And then identity. So we may have lost access to different parts of our identity during those periods of isolation. To come back to my example of losing a job, part of your identity might have been rooted in that job. And so when you lose the job, you're also losing access to that part of yourself. And that can be very disorientating and confusing. Similarly, you might have lost a family member, and then you've lost your role as a son, a daughter, a niece, a nephew, or a caretaker, or even something as simple as hobbies. Say your hobby was playing sports with your friends. Now, during lockdown, that wasn't possible. So you lose access to that part of your identity.
Right. I'd like to add, in addition to your example about work and losing a job, for my foreign service community, a big thing that was happening is that, well, the jobs were largely safe, but the tasks of the jobs were no longer possible. So many people from the foreign service community serving overseas, they still had a job, but weren't able to do that job. They were required to stay at home. And that can be really difficult when part of your identity is wrapped up in your work. Even if you still have security, maybe that achievement or that working for the greater good isn't being fulfilled. And so it can still create that void, that vacuum that can be very distressing, because at the same time, those people were kept away from their families, unable to travel back, unable to enjoy the things that they, enjoy as a side benefit of the foreign service. And so even if we didn't experience a total loss, many of us at least experienced partial losses that made us reevaluate, why am I here? What am I doing?
Yeah, bringing up some of those really big existential questions, right? Yeah. So, yeah, we've been talking a little bit here about different ways of looking at suffering. And now, Faye, I think you're going to take us a bit more into what is suffering.
Right. Yes. Well, the suffering component here is, we've been talking about this for a long time. Existentialists, it's not new for us, and existentialism is in the field of psychology, but also philosophy. And so I want to just bring up some of the common components here. A big piece here is loss. You can see here all the different types of loss. Loss is a major part of the definition of suffering, because when we lose something, as we were just talking about, what's left behind it is a void. So we call this the existential vacuum. And it's the space of missing, what was once there that creates that suffering. If you think about the loss of a loved one, it's a really common example here. And then on the other side of the slide, you can see some of the other themes. This is where existentialism gets quite lofty or dark at times, and ways of thinking about who you are, ways of being, and maybe ways of not being as we approach death, our final existential concern there, really taking a look at a very difficult topic. Francis, you said you looked up the stats for deaths.
Yeah, thank you. Reminding me, I forgot to address the last existential concern there. So yesterday when I was looking it up, at the moment, the number of people who've died from COVID-19 is 5.73 million people. And normally we're pretty good at keeping our awareness of death just out of our minds. You know, maybe intellectually we know that one day we're going to die and one day our loved ones are going to die, but on a day-to-day basis we're not thinking about it. And during the pandemic that just wasn't possible.
Right, and it's very uncomfortable, and if we're not used to confronting death in that way and really looking at it, it's going to cause some suffering.
Absolutely, it really is. So moving on, what we want to look at now is, well, what do you do with that suffering? So I'd like to introduce an idea from Van Tolgerien and Showalter Van Tolgerien, and they put forward the premise that not only is suffering an existential issue, which we've just been talking about, but also that suffering impairs our ability to find meaning. And so what we're seeing here is that we all have schemas or core beliefs, ideas about how we see ourselves, how we see other people, how we see the world. And we use those to organize our existence, to make meaning out of our lives. And when something happens, it could shatter those beliefs. So for example, if I lose my job, or maybe I had a belief that if I worked hard, I would be rewarded and I would be kept safe from some of the harm that one can experience in life. And then my job goes and suddenly I'm not being rewarded for working hard. So not only am I negotiating that very difficult situation, but also how I make sense of the world, how I fundamentally see myself, how I fundamentally see order in the universe is being questioned. And that can bring up a lot of very uncomfortable feelings. It's what we call existential anxiety.
Yeah, that's right. And again, these concerns aren't new. The suffering has always been around us. Some of us are more comfortable or aware of it. Maybe it's a little bit easier for us to sit with it than others. As global citizens, many of us have experienced suffering at a very different level and seen suffering very differently than maybe people in our home countries have. You know, here in Vietnam during the pandemic, we had barbed wire and quarantine camps and closed borders that literally prevented us from going home or even just taking a break from all of our existential dread. And, you know, as well, we usually have an interesting mix of privilege in these times that makes us observers rather than participants to the harshest fallouts of the pandemic. And so there's a simple phrase that is related to this topic existentialists use a lot. It's originally attributed to the Buddhist religion, a belief of thought, and it's pain is mandatory, but suffering is optional. And so what we mean by that is, as therapists, like, we really want to emphasize that when you have pain, when you have these feelings that are uncomfortable, because as therapists we like to say there are no bad feelings, just maybe uncomfortable ones, that it's important to really feel them and move through them. We have to grieve. We have to, we have to move through all of this pain, and some suffering for sure is inevitable. But in the long term, largely internal processes is what dictates how long we spend in that suffering process and how long it is before we start moving on and redefining the meaning of our lives and the world around us.
Yeah, absolutely. We can define pain, maybe I'll use the words of Shakespeare here, those slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. Pain is inevitable. It's the things that come up, it's the things that happen to all of us. But suffering is how we respond to that pain. And one of the ways that we can reduce our suffering is by finding meaning in our lives.
Right. So we'd like to move on to the part of the theory and research that outlines some of the general themes of where we can go from here, where we can find that meaning.
Absolutely. So we've split this down into 3 categories, but you're going to see a lot of overlap between the 3 categories. And the first one is connection and community. If you can be rekindling those connections or establishing that community, what it's going to do is it's going to not only help to reduce your sense of isolation, but help to ground your identity as well. So much of our identity is formed and based within our community, right?
Exactly. And this exact concern is something that our clients have been struggling with, and all humanity has been struggling with long before the pandemic. This has been the focus of my practice for years. It's hard to make those connections, especially as adults, especially as expats, anyone who's moved to a new culture or community. This is something we just have to figure out as humans, and it's not easy. We have included some resources on our handout, but we just want to kind of clarify and normalize. This is not an easy or quick task.
Absolutely. And same with the second one as well. So the second one, we've put known identity and values. Now, this is something that I work on with my clients a lot, sometimes for months. And it's based around the idea that if we can really know our values, then it's going to help to reduce that feeling of groundlessness, because we have something that we can base our decisions on. We also will know where to draw boundaries in our life, because it's just as important to work out what you want out as what you want in your life. And in order to really know our values, we have to know our identity and the intersectionality of our identity, because so many of our values are culturally based.
That's right. Yeah. And I love working on values with my clients because it really gives us the answers of who are we now? How did we become this person? And where are we going next?
Again, big existential questions, right?
That's right.
Yeah. And the final one is comfort with death.
And you can think of this many different ways. You know, some people think about, connecting to something bigger than themselves, whether it's a cause or, a group or community. For some of us, it's just a life well lived, right? That we can be comfortable with dying if we can assure ourselves that we did what we needed to do in this life.
Yeah, this is an area where a lot of people turn to spirituality, religion, finding a higher power. Again, it's a connection to something bigger than yourself. And a lot of religions do answer these big questions around death.
Yeah, there's no right or wrong way there. So we've gone over kind of some of these theories and themes, but as we get ready to close today, we just want to leave you with this summary of things that you can do as an individual and as a couple or a family, whether that's your chosen or biological family. Here are some things that you can maybe look a little bit closer at, some action steps to move you towards that peace or comfort with this sometimes meaningless world. You'll see some common themes in there about naming struggles, building those connections, getting to know yourself and your values, comfort with death, even those pro-social behaviors we were talking about. And this will look different for individuals. It might be a little bit deeper than it might look for a couple or a family as you're building those things together, right? A little bit more of a system there. And again, we've created this giant handout with lots of resources because we know it's a lot. And obviously we're short on time in the presentation, but we really do encourage you, if you're interested in any of these topics, we've included things that we use in our practice all the time, tons of extra readings and resources, and we really encourage you to use those in your journey forward. And we hope that they can help provide you and yours. Feel free to share them with your community with some comfort as we continue to go through unprecedented times.
Absolutely. And if this is not feeling like a journey that you want to undertake by yourself, we've also included some guides on getting professional help. So some questions, questions that you might want to ask a helping professional, how to find the right helping professional for you, and some resources about how to do that, because it can be very helpful to have someone who's objective to your situation to help you navigate through these difficult and turbulent waters.
Right. Often as individuals, we're just too close to the issue. And so a helping professional really can help provide a different perspective, an outside perspective that can help us really unravel what we're going through and to find a way forward. So with that, we are out of time. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope to see you in the Q&As. We've left our contact information here. So if you'd like to reach out to us with any questions, or even if you'd like to connect professionally, please feel free to do so.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to us.
Yeah, take care.
Bye.